I'm Brianna Shigo. Welcome back to my Tuesday tips. Today, page 11 of the residential purchase agreement, more important descriptions. Starting from the top, buyer stated financing. This is just explaining that the seller has agreed to the purchase price, the close of escrow date, all this stuff based on the buyer saying that they can perform because they're getting a certain kind of financing to be able to perform. So if anything changes, it shouldn't interfere with the purchase price or the close of escrow unless it's agreed upon by all parties. Then we move on to section 7 where it says closing and possession. Where it says occupancy, it talks about how if there are tenants, the seller has to let the buyer know that there are tenants. The property must be delivered vacant to the buyer unless agreed upon otherwise. And if there are multiple units within the property, the buyer has to tell the seller which unit they'll be occupying. Section B, where it says condition of property on closing, the first part of that talks about how the property is being delivered as is. So unless you guys agreed to some kind of repairs or something, the property is going to be sold in the condition that it is currently in, okay? The second point talks about how if there are any like pools or landscaping that need maintenance, the seller will continue that maintenance up until the close of escrow, so they're not going to leave you with like a mess in your backyard or your front yard or whatever. And then it talks about how if the seller leaves items at the property, they're considered abandoned. And if you could send the agent a text or shoot them an email or something and say, hey, the seller left all this stuff. If they don't respond and come pick it up within 3 days, you can get rid of it. If that means just like selling something or taking legal action to get rid of stuff, that's when you have that freedom to do so. The section in bold just reiterates how important it is that you as a buyer get your inspections done and do your due diligence, because the seller and their agent only know so much about the property, so you really have to do your job and get all your inspections done so you don't have any kind of surprises that you don't like. In that letter C, seller remaining in possession after close of escrow, that just talks about if you allowed the seller to stay a couple days or maybe like 30 days after escrow closed, they recommend that you talk to an insurance agent and a real estate attorney just so that you can work out who would be liable for what in the case of something happening while they're living in your property, okay? Then letter D, at close of escrow, it just talks about how once escrow closes, everything transfers over to the buyer. And then the letter E talks about how at the close of escrow, the seller is to give the buyer all their keys, passcodes, gate codes, garage door clickers, any kind of information that the buyer could possibly need, the seller needs to give it to them. Number 8 talks about contingencies and removal of contingencies. The first and foremost being the loan situation. So that number 1 talks about how if the buyer is getting a loan, this whole thing is contingent upon them being able to pay as much as they say they're going to pay, okay? And it talks about how if you checked the I don't care about the appraisal box and it comes in lower and you have to pay all that money over, you cannot back out of this contract due to that. Due to having to pay all that money over because the appraisal came in low, because you checked that box that says, I don't care about the appraisal, okay? The second thing talks about how important it is for you as the buyer to look into home insurance as soon as possible, because that's a big deal, and they just want you to do your due diligence and get that over with. Number 3 talks about paying your deposit and your down payment, and that is non-negotiable. You have to pay those unless you guys negotiate otherwise. Number 4 talks about how removal of the appraisal contingency and the loan contingency are 2 different things. Number 5 talks about if there is no loan contingency, this is not the same thing as no appraisal contingency, so you still have to handle both things separately. Then the section B, where it says appraisal, it talks about how this agreement, unless otherwise specified, is contingent on an appraisal. So you could check the appraisal box where you say, I don't care about an appraisal, or it could be contingent upon whether or not the appraisal comes in at value, okay? Or number 2, where it says no appraisal contingency, it reiterates that appraisal contingency and loan contingency are 2 different things. Once again, they're handled separately. C talks about investigation of property. The agreement is based upon your getting your inspections done. Do you like them? Did you have to negotiate anything? And letter D, review of seller documents. This agreement is based upon, did you get the seller documents? Did you review them? Did you like what you saw? Do you have any questions? Are you going to negotiate anything? So that's that page. A lot of little nitty-gritty details that you really need to pay attention to and be aware of as a home buyer, because there's a lot that goes into this. And as always, if you have any questions or would like me to go over anything in particular, I'm here to help. And yeah.